fine.
Hello everybody, welcome to another edition of What's Going On. I'm your host, Tom D'Ambra. As always, we're very thankful you took the time from your busy day to view our program. My friends, I thought I would do something a little different. I've noticed in the show that we've gotten off more into a lot of current events and not so much into a lot of the history and some of the reasonings of where some of these different events originated, who was behind them. And I know we've been covering that, but I have seemed to, directing the show more to current events. And of course, the reason why that is that every day, almost every hour, there is something major going on. In the past, when I started studying these people decades ago, there might be a worthwhile, a tentative event that might take place maybe once every 3 to 6 months. Because of the escalation on two aspects that's going to bring us to, as Albert Pike called it, a cumulation crisis, is that two things. Is that as more people wake up, as more people, number one, get disgusted, and as more people start to ask questions, so goes our knowledge and it gains. So that escalates one side of this equation. And the other side of the equation that's making all these events escalate is that as the people do wake up and as they formulate a process, nonviolent process, to have some kind of remedy, to have effect, what that does is that causes them, the bankers, the globalists, whatever you wish to call, to escalate their game. And as we do this, folks, what we're doing is we're going to get to this point right here. As I said, Albert Pike called it a cumulation crisis. So that's what's going on, is that before we had the time to discuss previous important history, connecting the dots of yesterday's history to today's events. But I've realized that the pendulum has swung much more because the events are not just daily, almost hourly now, which makes everything much more volatile and potentially more dangerous. So what I want to do with this show, my friends, is I want to touch an article on you that was from King World News, and it's from a former London banker. And then I want to touch on what you may read in the mainstream media and what the sources that I read and who's behind this paper and why. So let's start off. Anyway, what I'm saying here, my friends, is that in the future, I want to get back to directing some of the available time we have with you. After all, we have a very short period of time with you. I would like to take the show back to at least dedicating some time to the origination of things like the Federal Reserve Act, what was the Civil War was about, what the Revolutionary War was about, who was behind all these different factions, the importance of money, the importance of the money system, the medium of exchange, why you have a birth certificate, why you don't own your land or your car, why we used to have common law in this country and now we have law mercantile, commercial law, why are attorneys called Esquire, which is a British title of nobility, and why are our courts under a foreign guild called the Bar Association, British Accreditation Registry, hence the term of title of nobility, Esquire. So what I want to do, because we have such a growing audience, I know some of the things that we report to you seem so abstract because, no fault of your own, you don't have a foundation in education and information to understand that most of what is presented to you is an orchestrated facade. And what's really going on in the world, you really don't know about. And to do that, we have to get back to understanding certain things like the Hegelian dialectic. And I'm going to do this real quick because I bring it up, because once you understand this, you will see this every day. Every single day in your life, you will see this being applied against the people. The Hegelian dialectic was a method to control societies of masses of people and to make them not only give up their liberties and their rights voluntarily, but it also made the people welcome the authority. Here's how it works. Picture a triangle, my friends. The bottom of the part, first corner of the triangle down here is you create a crisis. 9/11, Gulf of Tonkin, whatever it may be. Too many drunks on the road. We have to have roadblocks. We've got these kids that have measles now, so we got to vaccinate your children. I mean, it goes on and goes on and goes on. You're not allowed to know what you eat because of the GMO food. So create crisis, create crisis, create crisis. So you create a crisis. Use the one, too many drunks on the road. And I'm not at all, you're talking to a person who was involved in EMS for decades, at all saying you should be drinking and driving. But it was a method. Or if you want to take 9/11, a complete inside job, we'll go with that one. So you create a crisis. Second part of that triangle is you get an emotional response you want from the people. And as Hegel said, there has to be a heavy dose of fear. Fear and love are the greatest motivators of man. Can't use love, can you? So you create the crisis, you get that emotional response. Like he said, you got to have a heavy dose of fear. But if you can put in the mixture in this recipe to make this emotional response even stronger, where the people will be so enraged and so fearful that they won't even ask questions about the crisis event. Create the crisis. You get the emotional response you want from the people. They're in fear. They're in anger. The finishing corner of the triangle is that you bring in their authority and to make the people feel safe again because of the fear and anger that was created by the crisis that you orchestrated. So then the people, because of that emotional response, will give up their rights and their liberties. And then they will welcome your authority without a shot being fired. They have lost their liberties and their rights. That's just one, yet very important understanding that we need when it comes to understanding the methods of control and indoctrination that are going on. And we haven't even got into the school systems or the major media or any of that. Okay? Very important, but we're going to direct the show back to some dedicated time to getting into events and who was behind them in the sense of, say, like the Great Depression. What was the Great Depression? Why don't we have gold or silver backing our money anymore? Why are my children and I bonded? Okay. Okay, my friends. This is the article I wanted to read to you, and along with it, I thank Bill very much for putting this together with the charts that we're going to be showing. What was one of the things that we talked about with this Hegelian dialectic? What was the emotional response that you had to have? A heavy dose of fear. This is written by a very well-known author and banker. I'm going to spell his last name because I'm not so sure I'm pronouncing it right. It's Greyerz. I've heard this name pronounced 3 different ways, so I'm not sure which way this gentleman would like this pronounced. The name of the article is "We Are Now in the Frightening Endgame." This was written on July 23rd of this year. Subtitle: Fear and Propaganda. Egon von Greyerz. Stock investors are rejoicing about stock markets making new highs in many countries, totally oblivious of the risk or the reasons. It seems that there is an unstoppable rally in a new normal market paradigm. No major increase is expected in the inflation rate or the historical low interest rates. The present rally has lasted 8 years since 2009's low. There is virtually no fear in the stock market, so investors see no reason for this favorable climate would not continue for another 8 years at least. Yes, of course it could. All that is needed is that the governments worldwide, now listen to this, print another $20 to $50 trillion at least, and that the global debt goes up another $500 trillion. The gullibility of people today is exacerbated by the power of the internet and social media. Anything we read is accepted as fact or the truth, while a major part of it is just simply fake news. This is, of course, nothing new, as has been used by governments for centuries. Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, who was an expert at manipulating the German people, said, if you tell a big lie often enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually believe it. And he went on to continue, but the lie had to be very big. Can you say 9/11? Can you say Trump-Russian collusion? How is it that the mainstream media is not covering the Clinton Foundation, the State Department under the direction of Hillary Clinton, giving away, or selling, I should say, 29% of the country's uranium to the Russians through a company called Uranium One, and putting ranchers and murdering Lavoy Finney off of their land to acquire said uranium deposits? Why is that not in the mainstream media? The power of the internet and the other media has facilitated the spreading news and propaganda to billions of people, and very few can distinguish if they hear or read real news or just fake news. Anyone in the government is incapable of telling the truth. Let me say that again. Anyone in the government is incapable of telling the truth. Automatically, when someone assumes an elected position, their Pinocchio nose grows extremely long, since their entire purpose is then to be all things to all people in order to be re-elected. This is why virtually no elected official has a backbone or any morals or principles, because if they had, telling the truth would make them simply unelectable. My life as a London banker from the 1960s through the 1970s. During my early professional years as a banker at the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s, I spent some time with a prominent UK merchant bank. This is what old-style investment banks used to be called before the Americans came in to dominate the sector. The senior bankers used to arrive at work around 10 a.m. Now listen to this work schedule, guys. The senior bankers used to arrive to work around 10 a.m. and then go to lunch about 1 p.m. The lunch would consist of at least one gin and tonic to start with, and then a good 3-course meal with a bottle of wine. Afterwards, some port with cheese and maybe a beer or two at the pub to finish it off. Then back to the office around 3 for 4 or 5 hours of work, and this is how the City of London would operate when it was the financial center of the world. And we have told you the City of London is not London. We've gone through that with you. Any transaction was based on a handshake and a brief contract. Lawyers played a very small role in this process. Deals were based on trust and personal relationships. Banks displayed total loyalty to their staff and employees and did not fear for their jobs. Major deals were concluded with a minimum of legal interference, and compliance hardly existed. And still, there was very little deception or fraud. He's talking about the banking industry here. Contrast to that today. Today, the financial world in London and major parts of the world is dominated by U.S. investment banks, the U.S. legal system, and the U.S. government. Trust and loyalty is gone. Handshakes are worth nothing. Lawyers dominate everything, and contracts are now running to hundreds of pages. Staff fears for their jobs since the banks have no loyalty to them. The only thing that counts is short-term performance. This makes staff totally disloyal, as they know they can be fired on a whim. Investment bankers are now masters of the universe, and as the former Goldman Sachs CEO said, doing God's work. Well, one thing is certain, that this is certainly no humility in the financial world today. Or as Michael Lewis said in his book, Liar's Poker, major parts of U.S. investment banks are dominated by big swinging, DICKS, alternative traders with big egos. The system we now have is based on fake news, fake money, with no morals, no principles, no moral or ethical values. Let me read that again to you. This is a man in the know. The system we have today is based on fake news, fake money, with no morals, no principles, and with no moral or ethical values. In spite of, or more correctly because of, all the lawyers, government legislation, compliance and regulations, the financial system is today functioning much worse than ever with more fraud, more government intervention, and more manipulation of the markets. Also, clients today are secondary. Instead, it is all about lining the pockets of the bankers with their multi-billion-dollar deals and multi-million-dollar bonuses and their options. As we experienced in 2006 through 9, profits are for the bankers and losses are for the governments. Let me read that again. Profits are for the bankers and losses are for the governments. Do you remember how we read to you in the Federal Reserve Act what one of the 6 priorities when they met at Jekyll Island? What was the last one? When the system fails, transferring the liability and debt to the people. We read that verbatim to you. How they were going to take control of the money system, how they were going to confiscate the wealth, the properties, how they were, all this. And the last one, when the system failed, how they were going to transfer the debt and liabilities to the people. They've done it through your birth certificate, and they're doing it through the force of hand of the government. This is what this is about. During that time of great financial crisis, many investment bankers received the same bonuses during the crisis as years before, in spite of the fact that most of them would have gone under without the government support they benefited to the extent of over 25 trillion T-Tango dollars. Now, let's stop right here. First of all, we read this to you, and the last track we had was $26.3 trillion. Now, I want you to understand this. The bankers got all of this. They not only got all of this, my friends, you are held liable through your sweat equity, force of hand through the government, contracted as a co-surety to the birth certificate, to have to pay the interest on this $26.3 trillion because of the lack of money system we have, because not only do these bankers get the $26.3 trillion, but now you and I, because we're bonded in bonded serfs, we're literally chattel, movable property which has been liened. Now we have to pay these very same bankers who received the $26.3 trillion interest on every one of that, every single dollar of the $26.3 trillion. Why? It's because I misspeak, my friends. They're not dollars. Dollars are 25.8 grains of gold in a 15:1 ratio of silver. There is no gold, there is no silver backing your medium exchange. You do not even have money by Black's Law Dictionary, because money does not encompass debt/notes. What's a note? An acknowledgement of debt. That's why there's 2 signatories. One's the creditor, one's the debtor. You're the co-surety. Understand how this is all working. They made money all the way up, the bankers did. And they made money all the way down, the bankers did. And now the bankers are going to continue to make money because they're still going to get their bonuses, and everything that we bail them out on, we have to pay an interest to it, to these very same bankers. Let us continue. We are now entering the frightening endgame. All this is proof of the fact that we are in the end of a major financial era that started either with the Renaissance, which came after the Dark Ages, or since the end of the South Sea bubble in the mid-1700s. I doubt that the cycle is of a smaller degree, like 100 years since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. Only future historians will tell us the magnitude of the current cycle. What is certain is that we are now in the final stages of a major era. It has been clear to me for quite some time that this will end badly. The inevitable implosion of the asset and debt bubbles that the world is now experiencing is guaranteed. But governments and central banks have for some time been able to fool most of the people by telling them that the emperor is wearing a suit of gold when he is actually naked. We have bubbles in every aspect of our societies. Stocks are at ridiculous valuations. The Shiller P&E, right here, is at 30, which is where it was in 1929. What happened in 1929? The beginning of the Great Depression. Why? Because of what the bankers did. We're going to get into that again. We're going to do a whole review on that. For the sake of time, I've got to continue this article. I'm sorry. But still understand what he's saying. The Shiller P/E is at 30, which is exactly where it was right before the Great Depression. Still, it is below the 2000 level, which tells us that it could extend for a bit longer. On many other measures like valuation to GDP or sales revenue, markets are past or near all-time high. The graph that I'm showing you shows the margin debt of the New York Stock Exchange, which is substantially above the 2000 and 2007 levels. Understand this. Not just stocks, but virtually all assets are at record levels, whether we talk about the biggest bubble in the world, which is bonds, or property values, which are inflated by interest rates manipulated down to the lowest levels in history. I have in many previous interviews and articles stressed the problem of both the U.S. global debts, which have grown exponentially in the last half century. These high debts have inflated asset prices, benefiting a small minority and at the same time impoverishing ordinary people. Just look at the real earnings of a U.S. worker. Now, folks, take a good look at this graph. And Bill, if we could put this up full, please do. Take a look at this graph. Down at the bottom, you've got periods in increments of 4 years. Okay? And at the top, you have earnings. Now, I want you to understand what the one thing this graph is not showing you is that $900 in 1964 was a hell of a lot of money. $900 today isn't a lot of money. Why? Because of a thing called inflation. Why? What is inflation, my friends? Inflation is when your medium of exchange has less and less purchasing power. So if you take a look at 1913, December 23rd, 1913, why do I say that date? Because where was the Congress on December 23rd, 1913? Of course, they were away for the Christmas break. How did the Federal Reserve Act get enacted then? We've covered that before. We're going to recover that again. But the purchasing power of 1913 as compared to today is 2 cents. In other words, my friends, not only have we lost the intrinsic value of our dollar, the 25.8 grades of gold, 50-to-1 ratio of silver that was put in by the Coinage Act of 1789, not only have we lost the backing, the intrinsic backing of it, not only do we now have a useless piece of paper script of a private for-profit foreign bank called the Federal Reserve, but we've lost 98% of our purchasing power because 2 cents out of a dollar, you've lost the other 98 cents. I'm sorry, folks. I know you guys Common Core math can't do this, but that equals 98% of your purchasing power has been lost since the private for-profit bank Federal Reserve took over the issuance of the currency. And not only that, had they took all the gold and silver, and if you think it's at Fort Knox, just more gullibility for the people. I think JFK proved it wasn't. But besides all that, we have a debt that is due now for each one of these script pieces of paper that are issued. And it ain't that the Federal Reserve is using the gold and silver that they took from the American people through the force of hand of the U.S. government on March 9th, 1933, but also that the people are now a co-surety to the interest that is due because a private bank with mere ledger entries gives the insolvent USA Incorporated permission to print them. There's an interest bond due on them, and you and your children are the co-surety to this debt. Are you with me? So why 1973? I want to tell you why. Because some short time right before then, President Nixon, by force of hand, he really didn't have an alternative because there wasn't enough gold or silver to back up even the domestic money. Silver was gone, but they were trying to keep the Bretton Woods thing established. So they went and they had a separate petrodollar, as you've come to know it, that was backed partially by gold and silver. Gold. That no longer could happen from 1971, 1973, they went through it all. It no longer could happen, so they had to take us off the gold standard completely. That's, my friends, why we actually formed OPEC and set up Saudi Arabia the way we did, formed the EPA to shut down domestic oil production in this country, so we could protect Saudi Arabia and we could also make them very rich, and then they would also, under contract, take a percentage of their earnings and buy the now new developed treasury bonds to keep this facade rolling. That's why Saudi Arabia bounces back from number one to number two in purchases or possessors of treasury bonds. It's where we are, folks. It's where we are. And this is the kind of stuff we're going to start getting back into a little bit. Okay. Let us continue. So this we're showing here why in 1973, look what happens to the hypothetical real weekly earnings. Look what happens here. Look where you are in 2016. Look where you are. Heck, folks, you're at 1977 era. Had a hell of a lot more purchasing power, didn't you? That you was taking home. Your income taxes were less. All your other taxes were less. Probably half of them weren't even implemented yet. What are you really taking home, folks? Think about it. Look at that graph. Get a good study of it. Okay, let us continue. I have in many previous interviews and articles stressed that the problem with both U.S. and global debts, which have grown exponentially in the last half century, these debts have inflated asset prices, benefiting small minority at the same time impoverishing ordinary people. This is now, he's breaking down this graph, which I just did, and notice this. Just look at the real earnings of a U.S. worker as the chart shows you, the one I just went over with you. They peak in 1973, and since then the perceived improvement of the Americans has been achieved with the aid of debt. Debt. The chart below shows that the gap in minimum wages and the standard of living. Understand this. Look what this graph is showing you, the blue line here, is showing you the percentage and how much debt has been used to facilitate this facade. The other graph in the background, if you would, shows the standard of living, and the debt to maintain the standard of living, and then the graph, as you see, it's more reddish purple over here on the right. Look where your standard of living is, folks. It's in the toilet. But look at the exponentially high level of debt that is being used to supplement that reduced standard of living. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? So not only is your standard of living in decline, but what you're a co-surety, the debt itself is growing exponentially. So you're paying more for less is what I'm trying to wrap up to you. You're paying more for less. And you're not only paying more for less with regards to debt and standard of living, you're also working harder, getting less for it at a 1976 standard with a dramatically reduced purchasing power and a much higher tax rate. How are you making out so far, Mr. and Mrs. America? I want to take a good look at that graph, my friends. Okay, the chart below, which I just went over with you, shows the gap between wages and the standard of living, has been filled by an increase in consumer credit and government debt. The sad thing is that most Americans or ordinary people in the industrial world do not realize that they are now enslaved by debt which they can never repay. Let us continue. Sadly, a big number of people in the world will be unemployed within the next few years. At that point, governments will be insolvent and print money which will be worthless. What makes this even more dangerous, my friends, is the BRICS. China and Russia using the yuan, partially backed by gold. Because ask yourself, my friends, what would you rather have in your pocket? Would you rather have an instrument of debt that is based on ignorance, apathy, and the sweat equity of the American people? Or would you rather have something in your pocket that is at least partially based on gold? What would you rather have? One that is in decline, or one that at least will always hold its value by that percentage that's backed by gold to any inflation swings? You don't believe me? What did it cost in 1913 for a very fine suit to be made in New York City? And I read this to you years ago. Do you remember what it was? It was between $25 and $35. That's right. You could get a fine tailored suit in New York City for between $25 and $35. What was the value of an ounce of gold then? $25. It cost you roughly to get a fine tailored suit in New York City, when I read this article to you, it was probably 2 years ago, about $2,000. I think it was $1,750 to $2,250 was in that range. And I remember reading the article. At the time, an ounce of gold was almost pushing $2,000. So my point being, my friends, is that even though the paper instrument, the dollar, which is not a dollar, which was in 1913, but now is no longer anymore in 2015 when we read this to you, that ounce of gold has maintained its value even though all the artificial pressures are put to keep it depressed, because they certainly don't want you to understand what gold and silver is and what intrinsic value is and what the medium of exchange you have in your pocket is right now. Why don't they teach this in the public school system? You would think the understanding of money would be one of the most foundational things for any people to flourish. They don't want you to understand money. You know why? Because you come to the understanding that you do not have any money. Money, again, my friends, does not encompass debt. Let us continue. The biggest wealth destruction in the history of the world. Sadly, a number of people in the world will be unemployed, as I get to saying. At that point, governments will be insolvent and print money will be worthless. There will be no Social Security, no pension funds. Hey, did you see what's going on in Illinois right now? How do you like that one, huh? Work all your life, you risk life and limb, and now you're retired, and you're about to find out that your pension plan is going to be 30 cents on the dollar. How'd that work out for you? Trust these bankers. 30 cents on the dollar. Don't worry about it, though. All these bankers are going to get all their big pensions and all their payouts and everything else. Don't you worry about them. They're going to be just fine. Can you imagine that? You're a firefighter, you're a cop, you're a school teacher, whatever, in the Chicago school system or the Chicago police, whatever, anywhere in Illinois. 30 cents on the dollar. There will be no Social Security, no pension system. The health care system will also fail in many countries with disastrous consequence. With most individuals totally unaware of what will hit them in the next few years, they will continue to accumulate debt while a small minority continue to speculate to accumulate wealth. The biggest wealth destruction in history. These speculators don't realize that most of the wealth they have today is due to credit expansion combined with governments printing money. So what, if you print more money, what does that make that instrument? Worthless. Remember the pictures we showed you when the Weimar Republic in Germany was failing? And we showed you the pictures of literally the German people taking blocks of German marks, Weimar marks, and throwing them in their wood stoves to stay warm. It was worthless. We showed you the picture of the wheelbarrow, the empty wheelbarrow that Hitler used rather well. And I got to be quick, but what he did was, there was a very wealthy man lived in Germany. His family had been doing business with this other family, they owned like a general store for years. He walked in there with a wheelbarrow full of money, asking for this, 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 and this, knowing the whole thing was collapsing. The store owner said to him, "Dump the money, I'll take the wheelbarrow for this and this." And Hitler was perfect politicizing that. Okay, these speculators don't realize that most of the wealth they have today is due to credit expansion with the governments and printing money. Any further increase, what's that do? Government's printing money. They got to get permission from the private foreign for-profit banks. Ours is the Federal Reserve. And then we go into more debt, which puts you into more debt. It's perpetual debt, my friends, because if you print the first one, then you got to print the second one to cover the original interest on the second one. Well, now the interest is double. Now you quadrupled. It goes on and goes on and goes on. It's perpetual debt. I think that was item number 2 or 3 in the Federal Reserve goals that we alluded to earlier. Okay, let us continue. Any further increase in asset prices will merely be due to the music playing faster and louder and will have nothing to do with real economic growth. Very few people realize that soon the music will stop, and at that point, all the assets inflated by debt will implode. This will lead to the biggest wealth inflated by debt. This will lead to the biggest wealth destruction in history, but as always happens at the end of a major cycle, it only turns when the maximum number of investors have been sucked in. This is why we could easily see even higher stock prices before it all collapses. Just look at the NASDAQ. Look at the NASDAQ from 1999 to 2000. From January 1999 to March of 2000, the NASDAQ went up 2.5 times. In the final stages of that euphoria, more and more investors were sucked in. The same could very well happen again. The nearer a peak the market is, the bigger the number of participants. Markets have a horrible tendency to punish as many as possible. Instead of riding the final rally and then losing 80%, as NASDAQ investors did after the March peak of 2000, now is the time to exit the market and protect your profits. Just look at what happened at the NASDAQ in relation to gold. Okay? Now, I want to show you that. This is the NASDAQ versus gold. Do you remember I was talking to you about how gold is I'm not trying to throw an investment price here, my friends. I'm talking about history. I'm not an investor. And I certainly am not purporting to give any advice. I'm using this graph to show you history. Look what gold did. It's unbelievable. The nearer, instead of riding the final raise, okay, I'm going to sort of go off of that, my friends. But I want to get into something here. I want to stop here for the sake. I want to get to this gentleman right here. He gets into potential losses of 75 to 99% in the market and so forth. But for the sake of time, I told you I was going to get into Paul Craig Roberts here. And I want to read his article very quick. I was also going to get into some of the things that are in my newspaper, the newspaper that I read that you may not read. Okay, and I want to get into it here. Just different things going on about what's going on with Senator Rand Paul, and he's trying to lead in the Senate about having to stop the funding of the terrorists. Not one other senator is going on. Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii, very courageous woman. She's got 13 representatives to sign on. Yeah, that's right, folks. That means out of the 535 members of Congress, 14 have signed on for the United States government to stop funding terrorists. Unbelievable. Gets into a recent study that was put out through GATT data proving how, all the thing about global warming, how they were altering the data, how they were taking the data, like from airport tarmacs, where instead of it being 88 degrees, it's 118 degrees, and things like that. The big pharma censorship, how the CDC now is sells about $4.1 billion worth of vaccines a year. Think about that. Think about that. Pentagon. The Pentagon is having second thoughts here, folks, on using illegal immigrants to fill the ranks of the U.S. military because of a potential security risk. Do you remember when we read to you how Mexico City, Mexico, at one time, this is about five years ago, was the #1 recruiting office of the United States Army? Oh yeah, Hungary purging alien influence. Hungary is fed up with the George Soros and his networks. Judge Aparo. Oh, here we go. Amish healer gets 6 years in prison for producing a salve. Amish healer gets 6 years in prison for producing an herbal salve. $4.6 billion worth of profits on vaccines, no problem. Children dying, autism, seizures, no problem. But if you're an Amish person and you make an herbal salve, you're going to prison for 6 years. Amish. Erica, men. Ish in Old Hebrew is man. Scottish, Polish, Irish. Is God. Ish. God man. You know them people are going to be getting prosecuted. Hell, they've already got TV shows propagandizing them already. Oh boy, okay, let us get to, I just wanted to go over, this is a great article by Ronald Ray. The War Against the Working Man. How from 1950s, 87% loss in purchasing power, just since the 50s. How Richard Walker, how ISIS was actually placed with all these weapons through the United States government and other entities. Direct U.S. military involvement in the Syrian gassing. How come that's not in your headlines? Brazen welfare fraud exposed in New Jersey to the tune of $4.2 million. How come that's not in your paper? How come they didn't talk about Freedom Palooza, how they're trying to stop that band? Okay. There's another one. How Target is going after gun grabbers. And here's a very courageous woman. Stacy Washington, a former freelance writer for the Post-Dispatch, is shown here at a recent National Rifle Association convention in Atlanta. This poor woman had the problem of writing the truth. Cost him her job. Okay. I got all excited, my friends, and I'm sorry, and I went right by Mr. Paul Craig Roberts' article. I am sincerely sorry. Here we go. Okay, Mr. Paul Craig Roberts. I want to just go over this real quick. Seymour Hersh, America's guess who gassed Syrian civilians, direct U.S. military involvement. This is Paul Craig Roberts, a man very much in the know. Seymour Hersh, America's most famous investigative reporter, has become persona non grata in the American propaganda ministry that poses as a news media, but only serves to protect the U.S. government's war's lies. Among his many triumphs, Hersh has exposed the American My Lai massacre in Vietnam and the Abu Ghraib torture prison run by the Americans in Iraq. Today, his investigative reports have to be published in the London Review of Books or in the German media. Why? Because no more in the New York Times. You're not going to write in the New York Times how the shooting of Osama bin Laden actually didn't take place. You're not going to do that anymore, Mr. Seymour Hersh. We're not going to let you write truth at the New York Times, silly boy. Let us continue. From Hersh's latest investigative report, we learned that President Donald Trump makes war decisions by watching staged propaganda on TV. The White Helmets, a propaganda organization for jihadists in the Syrian opposition, found a gullible reception from the Western media for photographs and videos of alleged victims of a Syrian army sarin gas attack on civilians in Khan Sheikhoun. Trump saw the photos on TV and talked to his daughter, and despite being assured by U.S. intelligence that there was no Syrian sarin gas attack or the U.S. military to strike a Syrian base with Tomahawk missiles. Under international law, these strikes was a war crime, and it was the first direct aggression against Syria by the U.S., which has previously committed aggressions via proxies war and groups like the Syrian opposition. You understand what he's saying? Proxy wars. This is what the United States government does. If you're a threat to the Bretton Woods Agreement, we're going to send in our agent provocateurs, form a proxy war, and if they can't get it done, we'll sell it to the American sheeple and have them send their sons and daughters to bleed for the Bretton Woods Agreement and bleed for the profits of the corporations. Oh, and you get to pay for it. And the Federal Reserve gets to make all the interest because they gave the insolvent corporation, USA Inc., permission to print it, to facilitate, to send your sons and daughters to bleed for the profits of the bankers and keep that Bretton Woods Agreement alive. This is where we're at. Reporting on his sources, Hersh writes, in a series of interviews, I've learned that the total discontent between the president and many of his military advisors and intelligence officials, as well as officers on the ground in the region who had an entirely different understanding of the nature of Syria's attack, of the Syrian attack. I was provided with evidence of that discontent in the form of transcripts of real-time communications immediately following the Syrian attack on April 4th. The belief that sarin gas was involved in the attack comes from what appears to be a gas cloud. Hersh was informed by U.S. military experts that sarin is odorless and invisible and makes no cloud. We went over this with you. What appears to have happened in that the explosion from the air attack on ISIS caused a series of secondary explosions that produced a toxic cloud formed by fertilizers and chlorine disinfectants that were stored in the building that was hit. U.S. officials spoke with Hersh because they are disturbed that Trump based a war decision on TV propaganda and refused to listen to the detailed counter-assessments of its intelligence and military services, the story goes. A national security source told Hersh, everyone close to him knows his proclivity for acting presumptuously when he does not know the facts, he doesn't read anything, and he has no real historical knowledge. I don't know if I believe all that, but this is what he's reporting. He wants verbal beliefs and photographs. He's a risk taker. He can accept the consequence of a bad decision. In the business world, he'll just lose money. But in our world, lives will be lost and there will be real long-term damage to our national security if he guesses wrong. He was told, we did not have evidence of Syrian involvement, yet Trump says do it. Okay, folks. Who was Trump listening to here? He wasn't listening to his intelligence advisors. He wasn't listening to people on the ground. He wasn't listening to military assessment people. He was listening to the same people that the American people usually make a majority of their decisions on. The mainstream media. The mainstream media is nothing but a tool controlled and orchestrated by the CIA for the doings of the bankers and the globalists. So I think Trump, if this is all true, and I really believe Paul Craig Roberts, but I would think Mr. Trump learned a valuable lesson here, and I'm sure he has. As we see the moves like what's going on with Attorney General Sessions, who hasn't moved on things that Trump wanted to be moved on, and Jeff Sessions has moved on things that Trump had no interest in moving on. For instance, medical marijuana, as he said in his campaign, purely a state's issue. Federal government shouldn't be involved with it. Has no constitutional authority to be involved with it. Agreed. Let us continue real quick here, my friends. Anyway, I'm obviously not going to be able to get to this whole article, but this is another example of what you see in the mainstream media. Now all of these people, Paul Craig Roberts, Wall Street Journal, James Tucker, Ronald Ray, all of these people, Jim Traficant, all of these people that either were or have been writing for this paper were all involved in either government, media, or academia. And they all got together and said, I can't do this no more. As John Swinton said, we are nothing but intellectual prostitutes kneeling at the feet of Manning, selling our culture, our race, and our nation. Who was he? Very important person. He was a long-term editor of the New York Post, I believe, back in the day. It was either the Times or the Post, one or the other. Obviously knew what was going on. So, are you listening to the mainstream media and making bad decisions based on lies and propaganda, as President Trump did here? Recently, there was a poll done by a private firm, and I was going to get into it in this paper, but I don't have the time now because I'm running out of time, I'm sorry. But they did a wide, very diverse spectrum of a series, not just one, but a series of call or email or whichever. It was very diverse, a wide variety of methods of doing this survey. But they found out that under 20% of the American people trust the mainstream media. I read one to you some months ago where that figure was at 6%. So I would advise Mr. Trump and Mr. and Mrs. America to no longer not only be supporting these entities that are lying to you, but Key Bono, who's benefiting from their propaganda. And number two, who's orchestrating the lies to take you down what road? Think about that. And the same can be said for the indoctrination systems, and the same can be said for that there's public schools, and the same can be said for the 501c3 churches. They're all taking you down a certain road to benefit the globalist and to enslave the people through debt. My friends, we're very thankful you took the time of your busy day to watch our program. We always close in asking you to seek truth, obtain knowledge, manifest kindness to your fellow man, and we always close reminding you that your government is your responsibility. We thank you for watching.
Read between the lines.